What's up, guys? My name is Nick. Welcome back for another video on my channel. Today, in this video, we're going to be talking about the 3 books that I finished in the month of August. And I think we're going to be doing these little monthly reading recaps more on a monthly basis going forward because it sounds like fun for me to do. It's a little bit of a creative, I suppose, outlet for myself. I haven't made YouTube videos on YouTube for quite a while, and I kind of miss it. But before we do get started, I just remembered I know a lot of people that do these videos will give you like their rating out of 5 or something like that, because Goodreads and stuff. I'm not gonna do that. It just I personally don't. There's a certain thing where I kind of see, or I think that listening to other people give ratings of books when they read them, and I'm kind of like listening for hearing what they have to say and thinking about whether or not I like it or that's something that I'm interested in. Like, I kind of think that kind of stuff, the rating kind of factors into what I think about stuff, or kind of sets some kind of expectation of a book. And I don't really want to do that. I just want to tell you what it's about, generally, if I think it's good or bad, and the kind of person I think, or the kind of stuff that you might be interested, if that's what you want to watch, read. That's what I'm going to do. It's going to be super basic, no ratings, just a general broad discussion of the books. And we're going to get it started. The very first book, I think this is not actually the first book that I finished for the month. We're not doing this in any particular order. It just is going to be an order from most favorite to least favorite, just as the way that it works out. So my favorite book that I finished for the month is called The Last Smile in Sunder City by Luke Arnold. And this book follows a private detective kind of guy, a private investigator called Fetch Phillips. Fetch isn't his actual real first name. It's kind of a nickname, but he just goes by Fetch Phillips throughout the entire book. He's a private investigator. He's an alcoholic. He abuses pain medication, basically. It's not like, pain medications like we would know in this sort of day and age, but it's pain meds, basically. And he only works for magical creatures, I suppose you can say. Basically not humans. So in this world, in the setting, it's a fantasy setting, obviously, where you have different fantasy creatures and beasts and animals and monsters and stuff like that all kind of live in some sort of coexistence in one way or another with human beings, and they all kind of they exist. They have their conflicts, they have their moments where they're all happy and they like each other and stuff like that, and then there's moments where they don't. And where this book takes place, or the current present day setting of the book, all of the fantasy creatures and monsters and stuff like that, basically, who had access to magic, and that's how everything worked, and that's how they had their abilities, to be like a vampire and stuff like that, that they lost their access to the magic. There was an event that happened. Humans may or may not have been responsible for it, and so they don't have their magic anymore. So vampires, they are not immortal anymore. They do eventually die. Like elves and stuff like that who don't age. They aged very very quickly, in like the blink of an eye, so to speak. And so things have kind of flipped on their heads. And Fetch Phillips feels a little kind of guilty about that, or a lot guilty about that. And he kind of struggles with his role as a human being, whatever that is. And we'll find out if you read this book, what exactly it is that he did, what his past was. But he has a guilty conscience, and it kind of drives and it motivates what he does and doesn't do, like how he investigates. Basically, obviously the most obvious thing, which I already told you, is that he doesn't work for humans. Like, absolutely, he doesn't work for humans. And he does all of his work for other non-human beings, which is very cool. I personally really like this book. The setting of it, the fantasy setting, is cool. It's kind of like a noir detective mystery where it's kind of grim, it's a little dark, it's pretty kind of like, I don't know about serious necessarily, but it definitely is very kind of cool. It's a very cool setting. Fetch Phillips is cool. I like him. His backstory and his history is very very interesting. It's very troubled. It's full of horrible stuff. from his childhood all the way up to some point in his adult life, even leading up even to, the present day as Fetch Phillips exists in the pages of this book. It's very cool. He's, I think, pretty complex, in his relationship to all of the different people that exist in the world in which this book is set. It's very cool. Kind of seeing him sort of struggle with his inner demons and his guilt and his conscience and his general, being an alcoholic and other stuff like that is also kind of cool, in an interesting kind of way. And then again, just being set in a fantasy setting where you have all of the, fantasy creatures and stuff like that we all are pretty familiar with that also kind of exist. And, they live relatively normal lives these days, at least in this book, because they don't have their, magic to kind of help them do have all of their special abilities, is also very cool. So there's a lot of really cool, unusual sort of stuff going on in this book that makes it very, very interesting. Very good. If you like some noir, you like mystery novels, you are interested in just a very interesting kind of fantasy setting, then I would definitely suggest you check this book out. Give it a try. Read it. It's very, very cool. I like it quite a lot. Moving on, the second book that I read and finished is titled Our War by Craig DiLouie. This book is basically set in a United States where the president was impeached and then he was convicted and found guilty by the Senate. And then after that, he refused to give up his power and leave office, or, not resign, because he was convicted. He was removed from office, but he refused to leave. And so that action causes a civil war in the United States. And this book is set in the city of Indianapolis, where Indianapolis is controlled by the liberal side, the more, the liberals. That's in this, they're called the libs, the liberals. That's what the faction is. They control Indianapolis. It's the only area in the entire state of Indiana that the libs control. The rest of it is controlled by conservatives, the red side of the whole argument. And to be honest, there was a moment at the very beginning of this book where I was like, this is basically based on a little teeny tiny kernel of actual real life possibility that could happen, and then it was taken to the extremist degree that anybody could possibly imagine, and that's kind of cool. There's a little bit of it that I think is very, very awesome. So this book primarily follows two characters on either side of the fight for Indianapolis, and the main thing that's supposed to be kind of shocking and troubling and sort of is a lot of the catalyst around the story is that the two of the primary characters in this book are actually teenagers, children. One of them I think is actually 11 years old, if I remember. So they're child soldiers. Both sides in this civil war are using child soldiers to fight the fight because they basically ran out of adult manpower. And they need the kids to continue effectively fighting or, to win whatever it is that they want to win. So there's a lot of stuff in this book that is supposed to be, and actually is kind of, troubling and disturbing a little bit. Obviously the idea that these factions and the militias that are fighting the Civil War would be using child soldiers is definitely not a comfortable, topic. But I mean, it happens. Civil wars all over the world. That kind of is a thing that happens. The idea that would actually take place in the United States is a little absurd. At least, sitting from where I'm at right now, it seems like, well, it wouldn't happen in the United States, but you never know, dude. Like civil war and war makes people do some absolutely crazy and horrible things. So there's a little bit of that going on. One of the other layers is just the fact that, kids can be told to, whatever it is, that they want to hear, or that they can be convinced of things much more easier than adults can. So they're more easily swayed to do things that they wouldn't otherwise do and that are horrible. And so basically using them as child soldiers or convincing them to be used as child soldiers is some sort of abuse, which I think we could probably agree with, that that's not a good use of children. And there's just a lot of it that is, it's kind of uncomfortable. there's just a little bit of this. There's a nagging throughout the entire thing that this is really not very great, and it's a little uncomfy. But all in all, I think that the whole thing was actually pretty good. The only downside to this is that the end of this story is basically, I'm pretty sure, supposed to be devastating. There's supposed to be a super heartbreaking and very, very emotional thing that happens as like the climax of this story. And the downside of it, and just I have to say, unfortunately, I just didn't really kind of feel, it didn't like, hit me like the author probably intended it to, or like that it should have. And I think the reason for that is just because this story flips between the perspective of like the two more or less main characters and those two other who were like also main, but not really like the primary characters. But it just kind of flips between the perspective of four different characters throughout the entire story. So you don't really get a depth of like who all of the characters are. And so when the event happens, the climax of the story happens, I personally just wasn't really deeply connected to any of the characters to really kind of feel the emotional, outcome of this. And that was just me personally. Maybe you'll find it different, but all in all, I thought that the book was very, very enjoyable. I wanted to actually read this every single day. Like I try and read a couple hours every day. And there wasn't a day where I was like, oh, I don't want to read this book. It's going to be a pain in the ass. I wanted to read it. It was enjoyable. It was cool. It was a little bit of fun. I mean, as much as Civil War using child soldiers can be fun, but it was all very interesting and definitely a relatively enjoyable video. So if, Civil War, child soldiers, the morality of all of that kind of stuff kind of, is interesting to you or seems something that you might want to check out a little bit, then I suggest you read this book because I don't think that it's actually a very bad book. The final book that I want to talk about, the final book in which I read, and I think I'm just going to cover this one super briefly, not particularly in a extensive amount of depth, but that is called The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner. I'm sure that this is not an unknown book to people. And if it is, then that's cool too, because personally I didn't know that this book existed until a friend from work who I kind of do a little book club thing with, like, picked this book for the month for us to read and discuss. And I read it, and when everything was all said and done, I kind of enjoyed it. It wasn't a bad book. It was kind of hot and cold on it, to be honest. If I wasn't reading it for somebody else, I potentially would have DNF'd it. I would have just put it down at some point halfway through the book, but I wasn't hating it, and I was actually, like I said, I was quite enjoying it. It wasn't horrible, so I finished it, and of course part of it was because I was reading it for somebody else too, so that played a factor. But I'm glad that I did finish it because the end of the book made it worth it. So this story basically follows a thief who was captured who was in jail at the beginning of the story, who was then not really freed, but put to work by one of the rulers of the kingdom or the nation who imprisoned him, to then go out and find a treasure for the king of the country who imprisoned him. And that's kind of the beginning of the story. Where we end is something completely different and was very, very cool. Which I'm not going to give it away because it's very, it's a thing. It's the whole kind of point of why we're reading this book, I suppose. It's the end, it's the climax. It's the thing that makes it very interesting. But just, that's the basic premise. It's a thief. He's supposedly the best thief in all the land, in all the world, that anybody knows. And he's supposed to steal this thing that's in theory impossible to find, and it's impossible to actually steal in general once you do find it, if you do find it. And that's very cool. The ending of it was very who he actually was, who he actually worked for, stuff like that was kind of the twist. And that's the moment that I found very, very rewarding. All of the work to read through this book was very, very rewarding. What I didn't like about it, and what probably would have made me put this book down at some point, was really just the fact that the reading level of this book is quite low. It is young adult book, so obviously that makes sense. But personally, I don't really read young adult. Not like I have anything against it, but when I go to a bookstore and I want to pick up and I just want to look at books, because that's what you do at a bookstore. I just want to browse and look at some books. I don't go to the young adult section. I just don't. And I'm probably missing out on a bunch of really good stuff, but I don't specifically, pick up young adult books. And so with this being a young adult book, and it's probably not really just young adult as in general, but maybe just the way that this book specifically was written, is that the depth of description of what's going on and the people involved in that stuff is not particularly descriptive. So the world and the people and the characters and stuff like that are not very immersive. So if the first 2/3 of this book is basically a journey from point A to point B, it's not very descriptive of the environment in which this whole journey is taking place, and the people and their personalities and that kind of stuff, and the descriptions of who they are and what they look like. It's not very descriptive. Everything was kind of boring to me. That was just me. But like I said, doesn't mean that it is bad. It doesn't mean that it wasn't enjoyable, because I did kind of enjoy it. But if you're reading something about a journey through a place, from one place to another, I kind of want the environment and the description of that environment to be more immersive and descriptive than this book specifically was. So that's what I didn't like about it. But like I said, all in all, it's pretty decent. I would have ultimately, probably under normal circumstances, I potentially would have just put this book down and quit it halfway through, but I didn't, and I'm glad that I did. So if you want to read a book that is about a thief set in a fantasy setting and is a young adult book, if you particularly specifically like young adult, then check out The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner, because I personally didn't like it, but it's just the kind of book is just not really my cup of tea. Not like I don't like fantasy and I don't like thieves, but just specifically the writing and the immersiveness of the world thus far in the story is not my thing. All right, so I did not realize that the lighting for the background kind of went out on me at some point during this video, so I suppose that is the perfect time to wrap this up. And my future videos, I'm going to try and make these shorter, because they're not supposed to be 15-minute long videos. So we want to be more succinct and to the point and less rambly. So that's what we're going to do. I think what I'm going to do, though, because I really would like to talk about Our War in more detail and actually give away plot points and do more of a review of it for people who've already read it. I think I'm going to work on doing that coming up in the next week or so. So if you're interested in a book review kind of thing, then definitely check that out. If you liked this video, you want to see more stuff and just kind of, follow me as I refine my trade with doing these, because I've never done this before. Do the whole like and subscribe and the comment stuff, what everybody says at the end of their videos. And I'm going to just wrap this up real quick, and I will say goodbye to you guys. So that's going to be it, folks. I will talk to you coming up very, very soon.